Stop me if you've heard this one before. GoldenEye 007 was one of the greatest games of the 90s and revolutionised the idea of the first-person shooter on consoles. GoldenEye 007 is one of the most iconic and beloved games ever. For people of a certain age, you don't have to make the argument that the Nintendo 64's GoldenEye 007 is the greatest game of all time. It's already the game of their childhood, or their teen years, or their college experience. Regardless, it's inarguably one of the most important first-person shooters of all time. This is, as I have always heard GoldenEye described, every single article you will ever read on the game starts with a caveat like this. I've heard this my entire life. Literally, because the game is older than me. Now, I'm sure it reflects some sort of character flaw in me that anytime someone describes anything unironically as the greatest game in the history of video games, my impulse is to argue. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, yeah, and all that lovely shite. Listen, there is no way in hell that the greatest game of all time was made in 1997, okay? It's just not true. There is absolutely nothing GoldenEye does that hasn't been done better in the last 28 years of video game innovation, and that can make it hard from a modern perspective to see why anyone could consider it the best game of all time. My reasoning is flawed. I know that. Greatest thing of all time is not a position you arrive at logically. You arrive there emotionally. For this article in particular, it's not really a statement about the quality of the game, but about what the game means to the author. The friendships the game forged and the impact it had on their life. You can't really qualify that in any sort of rational, logical way. Being annoyed at statements like this makes me the asshole. The struggle of retro gaming for me is separating the genuine innovation from the rose tinting of nostalgia. Not my nostalgia, other people's nostalgia. I don't play retro games for fun. I can't play retro games for fun. I'm a modern man who enjoys his modern comforts. Things like having any idea what you're supposed to be doing, for example. I want to do better. I want to try and understand why someone would consider GoldenEye the best game of all time. So, in honour of the first new James Bond game in over a decade, I decided to actually play GoldenEye and see what all the fuss is about for this game I've heard so much about my entire life. GoldenEye 007 is, very loosely, an adaptation of the movie of the same name. Licensed movie games have a reputation for being cheap, worthless garbage, and that reputation did exist all the way back in 1997. GoldenEye bucks the trend in two ways. For one, it's not cheap, worthless garbage, but more interestingly, it came out 2 years after the movie and thus isn't really a tie-in game. It came out just a few months before the next Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies. GoldenEye, the game's reputation, almost supersedes the movie's, which is unheard of for any other movie tie-in game. Yes, GoldenEye introduced the best James Bond, the best M, the best Moneypenny, the best Sean Bean death, and is generally considered to be what saved the Bond franchise from bankruptcy. But GoldenEye, the game, made nearly double the amount of money and introduced the FPS to the console market. And it's hard to imagine what the gaming landscape as a whole would look like without that. GoldenEye isn't technically the first FPS on console, that honour goes to a slightly reworked version of Wolfenstein 3D, but it was the first one that convinced people that an FPS could work on console. Some people will still tell you that the only true way to play a shooter is with a mouse, and those people are assholes, but there is logic to that argument. A shooter requires accuracy, and a mouse gives you precision accuracy that is very hard to replicate with a controller. Apparently, GoldenEye convinced people that you could still make a shooter feel good with a controller, although I'm not sure how, because to my modern hands it feels absolutely awful. I played the 2023 remaster of the game on an Xbox, which graciously comes with a modernised control scheme as standard. You can set it to play like the old version if you want to, but that system feels so counterintuitive that it boggles my mind. Pretty much every console game for the last 25 years has used the two-joystick scheme, where the left joystick moves you and the right joystick moves the camera. This is so fundamental that it seems silly to explain, but GoldenEye predates this idea, because the N64 controller looks like this. There's only one joystick, so you can either move or aim, but not both at once. In the original version, you would have to hold the aim button, which would then switch the joystick from moving mode into a stationary aiming mode, and that just feels awful to me. Had I been forced to play the game like that, you would not be watching the video, but thankfully the remaster's modern concessions make the game possible for me to play. With a modern control scheme, GoldenEye doesn't exactly play like a modern shooter, obviously, but it plays close enough to one that it is possible for me to engage with and see what all the fuss is about. GoldenEye's innovations are not all about its controls anyway. The innovation also comes in its level design and its enemy AI. The 90s shooter is primarily defined by Doom. In Doom and most of its contemporaries, you have one objective: get to the end of the level and kill anything in your way. GoldenEye's big twist is objectives. The game plops you down in a big level with several things to do before you can leave, determined by the difficulty you're playing on. Some of these are simple, like take a picture of something, hack a computer for Q, disable the alarms. Some are more complicated, like rescuing hostages, or the very rare story moments where you have to stand and talk to a blocky approximation of Robbie Coltrane for a minute or two. There are some hard moments. Health doesn't regenerate, so you have to stay agile to avoid getting hit as much as possible. But the main difficulty is that the game doesn't tell you anything, in classic 90s fashion. You get a briefing at the start of each level from M, Q Branch, and Moneypenny, who walk you through what to expect from the level, but it's up to you to determine that this thing is probably the computer you're supposed to hack, right? There are no quest markers like you would get in a modern game, just trial and error. This is partly because GoldenEye's levels were created before the objectives and the enemies were added to them. There is many rooms and locations that have no in-game purpose other than to get you turned around and lost. If you fail an objective, the mission won't end, which is quite annoying. You have to manually restart it, or else finish it and then get a message from M that you botched it, go start over. If none of this sounds very impressive, it's because this is a foundational idea to FPS design. The idea of having to do stuff other than shooting things is just normal now. Foundations have to be built somewhere. They were built here in GoldenEye. It's the same idea with the highly advanced AI, which is to say that occasionally the enemies don't immediately shoot you and will instead run to ring an alarm or run to cover. This is basic stuff now, and as far as stealth games go, GoldenEye practically doesn't count compared to a modern stealth game. But for the time, this was something fresh and engaging, a mix-up from the Doom era of shooting endless waves of demons. Later games start to build plot and story around these concepts, that the extra things you're doing in the level have some kind of purpose other than a thing Q asked you to do for some reason. Or that the enemies are doing plot-related things like talking to each other or opening a crate or whatever. The game sort of tells the story of the movie, but without having seen the movie, none of it would make any sense or have any sort of dramatic impact. Even if you have seen the movie, a lot of it doesn't make sense. The plot is not the point of the game, it's flavour. The game borrows locations and set pieces from the movie much more than it does story. For example, there are several missions to infiltrate the GoldenEye bunker in Siberia, which is a location from the movie, but in the movie, Bond never goes there. Here in the game, he's running up and down that bunker, blowing up missiles and helicopters all over the place. This does give the game a surprising amount of variation. Since the movie is a globe-trotting adventure, the game is also a globe-trotting adventure. I know the visuals look like shit now, but consider that this game, at least the modern Xbox version, is just 311 megabytes. New James Bond's jacket is probably at least triple that size. My HD footage of the game is significantly larger than the game itself, but that's just how games used to be. Hardware limitations created strict barriers. Much lower than 311 megabytes for the record, the original game on the N64 was 12 megabytes. In modern terms, that is incomprehensibly small. Even the indiest of indie games still averages 50 times that size. In 1997 though, this was a AAA production. GoldenEye was created by Rare, that company that used to make a lot of really famous games but now just makes Sea of Thieves updates. Rare is one of the oldest video game companies still around, with a history that goes all the way back to the 80s. GoldenEye is not their most iconic title, not even close. But you probably have an idea of what AAA production looks like. Those glossy offices you catch in the background of a Bethesda update, or an expose on the working conditions of insert relevant game company into the script here. IO Interactive, the company making the new James Bond game here in 2025, has over 500 employees, and that's relatively small by AAA standards. In 1995, when Rare started working on GoldenEye, the company had just over 40 people, and only 8 to 12 of them ever actually worked on GoldenEye. Because what, are they going to dedicate their entire team to a trashy throwaway licensed game? The game only really exists due to the enthusiasm of its director. Rare was most likely going to turn down the license. But a relative newbie to the company, a programmer named Martin Hollis, asked the studio heads to let him make it because he was a really big James Bond fan. He then assembled his team of fresh college graduates and industry newbies to create what would end up being one of the most important games ever made. When people get all nostalgic for retro games, they're often getting as nostalgic for an era of game development as much as for the games themselves. An era when game developers were the scrappy underdog and not a corporate monolith that brings in billions of dollars in season pass money every year. There's a lot of personal touches in GoldenEye that wouldn't make it past the filters of modern game development, like the fact that every character except the characters from the movie are based on pictures taken around the Rare office. Starting with the GoldenEye team, like the famous Dr. Doak, who borrows his face from Rare's system manager David Doak, but as you get further and further down, you reach the cleaning lady or a plumber that came by the office one day to fix a broken toilet. This is both an extremely personal touch that would not be caught dead in a modern AAA game, and also a groundbreaking technical innovation. The idea of using real people's faces in a video game. Nowadays, the FPS, more than any genre besides maybe racing games, is tied to realism. A big part of Call of Duty is consistently pushing graphical fidelity as hard as it can go with each iteration. But GoldenEye, as silly as this sounds now, was one of the first games to aim for graphical realism. The team was given access to the sets, props, and costumes of the movie, and used hundreds of reference photos to recreate the movie in as meticulous detail as was possible in the 90s. This is standard practice for games now, but in 1995, realism in video games wasn't an ambition anyone was aiming for. But that's only the beginning of the small touches that contribute towards GoldenEye's realism. Yes, I'm straining that word, but in 1997 there wasn't anything better or more realistic than this. The way your gun sways slightly to simulate breaths, the way enemies react to the place you shot them, the way bullet holes are left in walls, the fact that sometimes you can shoot off the hats of enemies. These are all touches that are irrelevant from a gameplay perspective. They're immersive elements. Elements that these days are more or less expected and boring. That's the thing about pioneers. They're not always the first, but they're never the last. We always have a cultural fascination with pioneers, the Wild West. That's exactly how composer and sound designer Graham Norgate describes this era. I can't believe the Stampers thrusted a bunch of kids to make a game with such a huge license. It was still kind of the Wild West of video game development. I have complex thoughts on this. Games are always innovating and advancing, but that rate of innovation has slowed a lot over the last decade. Games today don't feel that different from games that came out 10 years ago. They're bigger, shinier, and more detailed, but there hasn't been any fundamental shifts in the way games are made for a very long time. Not in the same way that games from the 90s compare to games from the 80s. This is not surprising. This is the natural curve of any new technology. There's a period of growth and expansion as people learn the technology and how to advance it, and then there's a plateau, when it becomes less about innovation and more about optimization. Like the rise of pre-built game engines instead of building a new engine from scratch every time you make a new game. I'm sure there will be another boom era, there always is, but the last time I personally noticed a big shift in the industry was the switch to 8th generation in 2013, and the massive increase of visual fidelity it brought with it. Since then, there has been advances, but they're gradual. You only really notice them if you're paying attention. This has led, in my opinion, to the same kind of glorification that happens to the real-life Wild West. As this glorious era where cowboy programmers made the best games ever made, unburdened by corporate oversight or political correctness, depending on who you're talking to. This is not the age I grew up in. I'm sure it was very exciting to live in this era where there was big new technological advances every few years. Instead, I get to live in this era where people keep pretending something is the next big advancement, even though everyone can see that it's obviously bullshit. But just like the real-life Wild West, the frontier isn't all that it's built up to be. Regarding dedication, several of us commonly did 80-hour weeks and occasional 120-hour weeks. I averaged an 80-hour week over the 2.5 years of the project. The talent and dedication of the team was pivotal to the quality of the game. One more reason for success. It's kind of horrifying to hear the Rare designers of the 90s talk about the studio's workplace ethic and culture in the present day because most of them talk about it with such fondness. They have a reverence for crunch culture which I find sort of horrific. Crunch wasn't just a necessary evil for Rare in the 90s, it was glorified. People were shamed if they only worked regular 9-to-5 weekday shifts. They were viewed as not committed enough to the project. In fact, Rare specifically hired young, single, ambitious guys because they were the type of people who were more likely to work these excessively long hours purely out of ambition and eagerness. To me, that reads as transparent exploitation, but they themselves don't see it that way. I was in heaven. I was living in a bed and breakfast across the road from work. I would get up at the crack of dawn, like 7:30. I would have my breakfast at the B&B. I would go across the road and I wouldn't come back until midnight. I was working stupid hours because I was so excited to be working in video games. There's nothing bad about loving your job. Loving your job is great stuff, but having that love exploited at the expense of your own well-being is not so great. Heaven is almost where artist and modeler Addie Smith ended up after having a stress-related heart attack while working on Donkey Kong Country, and then nearly having another one while working on GoldenEye. All this to say nothing of representation and diversity. The pioneer era of games also happens to be the era where young white guys reigned supreme over everything. They made up the entirety of the GoldenEye team. The frontier of game development was a frontier for a very specific type of person. That's a complex, layered issue. There's a reason that all the famous bedroom programmers of the 1980s look like this. Not just the Rare guys, but the Ed guys, Sid Meier's, Will Wright. That entire generation of nerdy white guys who defined 90s gaming. Computers in the 90s were big and new and expensive, and only middle-class white dudes had the time and money and space to engage with programming as a hobby. These guys weren't racist, at least most of them weren't anyway, but this legacy has left its mark. This was, after all, the era that gave us the booth babes. Because young white dudes in the vacuum of all diversity tended towards a very college bro outlook on everything. As someone who didn't grow up in it, I find it very hard to separate the nostalgia for the games and the innovation from the nostalgia for a time when games were made by and for a very particular group of cis white dudes. There's a level of, usually unintentional, vinegar behind a statement like games peaked in the 90s that I find impossible to ignore. Games peaked in the 90s for a very specific sort of person. Another of the many reasons I have such a personal vendetta against nostalgia. Nostalgia blades you to real issues, not just antiquated design. And yeah, despite it all, despite the hype, despite my apparent hatred for all things old, apparently, I do get it. Because despite it all, I think I like GoldenEye 007. I got a comment on my critique of Halo Combat Evolved that stuck with me the entire time I was playing GoldenEye. Someone was annoyed with me for saying that Halo 1 felt dated, when Halo 1 hadn't aged badly at all, not like GoldenEye. That game was unplayable now. It became funnier in my head as I played GoldenEye through, because I think that once you get over the visuals, GoldenEye has aged better than Combat Evolved. Halo 1 is an all-time classic, don't get me wrong, but because it's closer to a modern game than GoldenEye, you play it like a modern game, and it comes up short in comparison. GoldenEye still fits into older rhythms of play, so you play it like an older game. It's a simpler game, but it pushes simplicity as far as you can go. More complicated than Doom, less complicated than the games to come, which makes it very easy to pick up and start playing even 3 decades later. I can't play the multiplayer that was so integral to people's love and nostalgia for the game because online multiplayer is exclusive to the Switch version and my life is not set up to accommodate 4-player couch co-op sessions. The fact that I can play the game at all is a small miracle of corporate agreements and negotiations and contract renewals. But the single player is more enjoyable than I ever expected. I had to use a guide for a lot of it, especially on 00 difficulty because my patience for walking around in circles is extremely low, but still. I think more important than Brosnan's blocky face or the set design, the most important thing the game imports from the movie is the tone. It's a silly game. It never takes itself too seriously. You can feel the fun that the designers were having making the game, and that means you're having fun. From the Oscar-worthy performances the guards give as they die, to the way that absolutely everything blows up in a fiery explosion, regardless of how little sense it makes. I think when people say that they miss that personal touch in video games, it just means they don't play enough indie games. It's not that hard to find a game with a personal touch. But GoldenEye does feel surprisingly indie that way. It charmed me. Do I think it's the best game ever? No. Do I understand why someone else might think it's the best game ever? Also, no, it's 28 years old, find a newer game to play. And yes, I am going to be annoyed when everyone starts comparing the new Bond game to GoldenEye. It's already started happening. But I do appreciate what GoldenEye did, the legacy it built. It may not be my favourite game, but it is the foundation on which many of my favourite games are built. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here, or just support the work that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me. As well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell because there's a spy trying to infiltrate my bedroom. Me and my friend Nathan are currently watching through all of the James Bond movies for our podcast Enter the Bondverse, so you can find our GoldenEye episode up here, or for something completely different, here's a video about racism in Star Trek.